the performance, it's not as big a thing as we all make it out to be. And
Mhm.
really, it's about the usability of it. And I think that's
Yeah.
what's really going to win.
Hey, welcome to this edition of the Data Nerd Herd. On this episode, we have Brian Suk. He is the Associate CTO at SADA and was previously an OG at Google Cloud. We talk about his career in the world of data, where data is going. We also talk about his experience as a consultant and ways to make customers happy. And finally, we touch on some of his hobbies like birdwatching in New York, where he lives. So I had a lot of fun with this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Going great. How are you?
Good, good. So today we have Brian Suk on the Data Nerd Herd. What's up? So for people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. My name is Brian Suk. I'm based out of New York City. I am currently the Associate CTO for Data Engineering and Analytics here at SADA Systems.
Nice.
Previous to this, I got into this role because I just came off of a 5-year stint at Google Cloud, joining Google Cloud back in 2016 when it was a much different era. Compute Engine was still in beta. I think the console menu had about 6 or 7 different items in it, and the team was only a few hundred people worldwide, which is a vastly different world from the tens of thousands of folks that it is now.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, just prior to that was at SAP Business Objects doing business intelligence, warehousing, Sybase stuff, and before that, Informatica. So just always kind of been in the data warehousing analytics space my entire career.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've been following your career. I mean, we met a couple of years ago at Next, and yeah, I was impressed. You seem to just have like a really vast background in data, especially data warehousing and pipelines and all that stuff. This guy's definitely somebody I need to know better. So
yeah, I mean, that was actually something I kind of fell into accidentally, to be completely frank, because it was the one job that I didn't mention was actually Computer Sciences Corporation, back when that was a thing, back when the company existed, before it kind of merged with a part of HP to become DXC that it is today. But yeah, it was my first job out of college, working as the associate consultant on a project for a broadcasting company that we got staffed out to. And they said, hey, Brian, you're going to learn this Informatica thing. You're going to learn what data warehousing is. And I said, sure. But it quickly dawned on me that in computer science classes, at least back then, they don't really teach you what a data warehouse is or what an ETL pipeline is. Everything's very theoretical about programming and, data structures, but no one tells you how to actually practically put things into practice. So that was interesting. As far as a learning journey was.
I can only imagine. Walk me through that real quick. I mean, what was it like coming out of, I guess, like picking up data? Because especially back then, it's not like it is now where, you could basically just anywhere you go, you could pick up a data warehousing tutorial or anything like that. I imagine back then it wasn't quite as easy.
No, it wasn't, because I think compared to today, where everything's moving towards a very self-service, cloud-based approach, lots of tools and lots of databases, like everything is open source and freely available, compared to back then, where everything was kind of locked up behind the gated keys of Oracle, IBM, SAP, and the large software vendors. So even if you were an undergrad and you wanted to learn about these large appliances and how they work, the schools had to pay. Well, I'm guessing, but the schools would probably have to pay some sort of licensing fee to use it. There's all these contractual agreements versus now where you can just kind of have people spin up, instances ad hoc on AWS, GCP, or Azure and just kind of do your thing and get out and then minimize costs. The model for learning, from what I understand, is very different from what it used to be. And I think that's, as far as the data world goes, I think that's a very exciting thing, because it means that these concepts that I think are very important that you and I and we all work in are now sort of being democratized to a certain extent.
Oh, for sure. Like I know in my class I teach at the University of Utah, so I teach an advanced analytics using SQL class, and we use BigQuery.
Nice.
Right. And use the public data sets in BigQuery. The students love it because there's nothing to spin up. You just kind of get going. I like it because I don't have to teach anyone how to spin up SQL Server on a VM, kind of like
Yeah.
back in the days, right? And that's like half your class, and you don't actually learn anything else because you're just doing that. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
way easier.
I do remember back in undergrad, that was one of the biggest pain points is we wanted to do these cool projects and build these things, but we spent most of our time just getting whatever Linux subsystem set up on our local laptops, and then oh no, we were pulling an all-nighter trying to get it done, and someone spilled coffee onto the laptops, and there goes everything. And it was a nightmare of an experience compared to what it is today. So it's much better.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's awesome. I mean, kind of, you talked about Google Cloud for a bit, and you mentioned, I mean, you're kind of one of the, sounds like one of the OGs there back in the day, with all the products. Like, walk me through that progression with, because I mean, in general, we talk about VMs and stuff, but that also was challenging several years ago, and now it seems like infrastructure now is just click of a button, swipe your card or enter your card, more like it, and you're done. So.
Yeah, and it was really, so that progression was kind of interesting because one of the things that I didn't know, well, with regards to Google's infrastructure, there were a lot of things I didn't know before walking into the doors of that company. But one of the really, at least to me, one of the really interesting things thinking back to that experience and watching the progression of products being released over time is, in the sales pitches and the introduction pitches, they mention it a lot, but it surprised me to the extent of just how much it was true, in that a lot of the products that you see that are released in Google Cloud really are not new things to the company in some way, shape, or form. So BigQuery is a good example where when BigQuery was launched publicly back in, I forget when, 2014, it was a while ago, but when that was released, it really was just an externalization of a tool that they've built in-house and have been using for almost a decade. Right. And so the way that they develop things is really interesting because they try to solve things for planet scale problems, because they're trying to solve things like how do you drop a YouTube video on one side of the planet and have it be instantly searchable and available on the other side of the planet. And so that means that the core technology of a lot of the things that they do are really battle hardened and battle tested at a planet scale level. So there's often, when a product comes out, a certain level of sharp edges that come with it, in terms of, hey, we're missing this thing in the API or that feature, and those things can be solved over time. But what's interesting to me is that the hard part of the infrastructure and technology and the new innovative concepts have already been fixed. And from there, it's just kind of smoothing out the edges. And I think that's what really gives them the edge in terms of product innovation and doing, the next important thing before you even know it's an important thing.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I look at Google's network, for example, and there's nothing else on the planet like it because there's nobody else doing what Google's doing. So Therefore, it's like for you to build a petabit global network would be very expensive for one. So and a lot of work. That's really interesting. Yeah, I remember when BigQuery came out, it was interesting that, I'd like to get your take on this. I felt like it was, dive under the hood and see what it can do. Like it's a great product. I felt like I didn't quite understand what it was when it was first released. Mm-hmm. And part of that, I'm not sure what I don't know what it is about Google. Like they have, I think, technologically some of the best products out there. Like no matter what it is, they're awesome. At the same time, I think it's really hard as a layperson out, who's not at Google, to understand. Okay, so how would I use this? I'm speaking like when App Engine came out, I felt the same way. It's like, this seems really interesting, but I don't quite understand it because it's not a VM, right? And BigQuery, when it first came out, I was like, this seems really cool. It seems really powerful, but I can't remember if it didn't have SQL back then. So I was like, well, like, how am I supposed to, what am I supposed to do with this? Then over time, obviously it matured to the point where it's like, I obviously use it all the time. So.
Yeah. And I remember once upon a time it was, what do they call it? They call it Google SQL. And that's what BigQuery only understood. So if you had an ANSI SQL background trying to port over, your analytics applications was kind of a little bit of a chore because you had to do the SQL translation, and inevitably something's going to break, and then you have to redo everything from scratch. I think one of the things, and this is what's been interesting joining a company like SADA as well, is historically Google has been primarily engineering focused, where they try to tackle the hard technical problems, and people will kind of figure out how to use it later. I think when in the last few years, as we saw the leadership evolve as well from the go-to-market side, we've been seeing the messaging change around more solutions-based approaches. It's not just technology for technology's sake. Here's how you apply it. Here's templates. Here's repeatable applications you can build on top of it. But the technology has been at the core of it. So BigQuery is a pretty cool example where from day one, from 5, 6, 7 years ago, the pitch has always been, hey, this separation of compute and storage is kind of important, and that's one of the core things that BigQuery does. Maybe you should pay attention to it. And whether it was just timing was off, or the messaging could have been tweaked to be more easily understood, we'll have to look back at that. But that's something that if you look at Snowflake's marketing, that is all over it, right? That's all they talk about that all the time. And I'm like, well, the Dremel engine has been doing that for about 10, 15 years now. So I think you're right in that they've historically struggled at, I think, leading people to the water as to how to use it, how to rapid deploy things, and why it's so important. And one of the cool things that I'm seeing here at SADA is that we get to, because we're doing a lot of systems integration work and a lot of implementation work, we're actually putting it into applications, and we're showing people why it's important and how it is in practice. So that's been an interesting switch for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, walk me through that too. I mean, you're at a giant tech company working on giant tech company problems, and now you're at the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to GCP consulting. I mean, walk me through that transition.
So that's been an interesting. That's been an interesting journey. Definitely the scale of the company is a little bit different, just because at a company like Google, you're at, 100,000 plus people. Right. I'm not going to lie. I do miss the free food a little bit in the cafes and the game rooms.
There's good food there.
Yeah, there is. And since I've left, I still keep in touch with my old buddies, and they tell me some new cafes have opened up, and I am eager to go back and try it. It's been interesting because coming to SADA, it almost feels to me a little bit more like what Google Cloud used to be back when I first started. Because back in the quote unquote early days, Google Cloud almost felt like a startup within a large organization in a sense, in that it was fairly independent. It was very early days, so there was a little bit of the company trying to figure out where it's going to fit in and how we're going to leverage it. And it, at least for Google, it really was uncharted territory. They've never done that kind of public cloud thing before. It's always been search or B2B applications or advertising. So this was something brand new for them. As it became more and more successful, it grew into the large organization that it is today, and the success is pretty cool to watch. But coming back to a company like SADA feels like the small organization that I knew Google Cloud once was, and that's been pretty cool. So, awesome. Everything has pros and cons to it. There's no perfect construct out there, but I do love the hyper obsession with customer success. I do love the ambition to look at a challenge and be like, yeah, let's figure it out. We're not going to be scared of it. It's like, we know we're going to make you successful. We don't know how yet, but we'll get there together. And just the freedom to try new approaches to solutions is something that's been pretty cool to see too. And I'm very excited about it next year.
Yeah. That's really cool. I mean, walk me through that for a bit. I mean, I do consulting too. It's an interesting game. Because you definitely have to mix technical expertise with just endless customer obsession,
Yeah.
right? Because you're dealing with customers, they
Yeah.
want things. So, but SADA's doing it at a scale that, I mean, I can't operate at, right? I mean, you're doing, you're just working with giant companies and so forth. I mean, what have you learned in terms of, I guess, customer obsession and making customers happy, through your experiences in consulting?
I think some of the core tenets, if I draw back on my sales background as well, I think are generally similar to sales in that, it's always just trying to be very cognizant of what the customer's telling you. And I think with implementation, it's no different than in a sales function in that oftentimes you have to read between the lines a little bit. If someone tells you there's an issue somewhere or someone tells you something's broken, there's a good chance that on face value, what they're telling you is not really the issue. And you kind of have to go unravel, pull on that thread a little bit and figure out what the true underlying problem is, whether it's organizational, whether it really is a technological issue, whether it's change management. There's so many different functions that could play into it. And I think with making customers successful, and this is just my 2 cents, this is not the official process and how we do it. This is just how I kind of see it personally. But the last thing I would probably say is just a little bit of empathy, just trying to be in their shoes. Like, everyone's stressed out, everyone's trying to hit their goals, and everyone has their own motivations. So it's the human factor and change management, which I think technological solutions are a dime a dozen, but really trying to figure out how to help a customer adapt to new technology. That's really, I think, what's going to set people apart.
Yeah, I totally agree. But it's also the hard part, isn't it?
It's the hardest part.
Yeah, because
a program you can debug over time, but a human, it's like there's no linter for humans. There's no.
Not really, especially when you're dealing with a bunch of them. So yeah, I've always found too, it's the organizational pieces, because I always look at things in terms of like people, process, and technology in that order. And I think a lot of times it's interesting right now, especially with COVID and digital and data transformations. I'd like your take on this too, but it definitely felt like COVID pulled 5 to 10 years forward of progress, or at least willingness to make a change. But with that too, I think there's definitely some growing pains, on that transition, just because it's hard. And so did you see the same thing where companies that may have been reluctant to, before COVID to get into digital transformation, so there's like SADA, like let's do some work together? Well,
I mean, so off the bat, the phrase digital transformation always irked me a little bit, because that, I'm like, what does that imply? Like computers were analog before that? Like, I don't think that's
they
really
were using paper before. Yeah. So.
I think COVID's been an interesting driver in shifting priorities, because I think, and I think that if I took a step back and kind of looked at society in general, and I looked at it in different ways, whether it's financial systems, or whether it's supply chain logistics, whether it's the way people do retail, whether all the way down to how we do computing, COVID's really, I think, it's shown a spotlight on the brittleness of a lot of our systems and institutions. And it's simple things such as, if I think about the supply chain crunch, and a lot of people had to take precautions, physically distancing in supply chain lines and delivery lines, and so it delays everything. It's not that much different in a data center, right? So you have people working in an office, and suddenly you're like, I can't put all these people in a tiny operations room anymore. How do I work around that? How do I make people successful in remote locations? How do I, work in a distributed manner? I think COVID's really shown us very quickly what happens when suddenly all these offices that we have, a lot of this infrastructure, we suddenly can't use it. And everyone's like, oh, what do we do? This is like, it's uncharted territory for a lot of people. I think for us, having a big focus on both GCP and workspace, it's been for us, we've been pretty successful because that we were pretty well positioned to help customers navigate that, especially in the workspace business, because that was probably the number one thing, right? Like if you have suddenly everyone go distributed, how do we work together? And that's something that workspace is pretty good at.
Yeah, I heard some of the early numbers when COVID hit, just people who work in workspaces. It was insane.
Yeah.
How much traffic and growth that thing had. So.
Yeah. And it's interesting how much that's forced the accelerated change in things like Microsoft Office's suite, because they've had to react to that market condition, because now they have to accommodate telework, and then companies like Zoom came up, and it's been really interesting to see the dynamics on who's gaining more customer share and who's losing out in this. But
yeah, I saw a stat the other day. What is it? Zoom, they're losing a lot of the small businesses now. I think I heard read an article on that the other day, and yeah, and then I think, but they're trying to get more big customers or something like that. So anyway, it was interesting just because I think as small businesses, especially, whatever normal is these days, I have no idea, but it's going back to something where you're not having to rely as much on Zoom. So curious to see where it all shapes up. Kind of switching to data for a bit. I mean, there's been a lot of movement in data as well. You got the modern data stack, for example, which I'd love to hear your opinions on. There's sort of just a ton of interest in AI and similar stuff. What are you seeing out in the field? What are you seeing an interest in modern data stack on GCP? AI apps, anything else?
Yeah. So in terms of general trends, I'm big things like BigQuery, Dataflow, a lot of these serverless applications are helping reach this goal. But I dream of a day where, like, the phrases disk, the phrases like, IO, like all that is removed from our vocabularies because we no longer have to think about it. And that just, it harkens me back to my SAP days when I would actually have to, once in a while, I'd have to go into a data center and rack and stack SAP HANA boxes and, plug in hard drives and flash drives and things like that. And that's just not a world I don't think anyone wants to return to. And unless you really love data center ops, in which case you work for a Google data center or an Amazon data center. But like, I don't think individual, especially small, medium businesses should be in the business of doing that.
Totally agree.
Yeah. And that's why I love BigQuery, because you don't worry about disk. You don't worry about that kind of stuff. You just kind of load it, query it, and off you go, right? I think the direction that data integration is headed in is very interesting to me. And I think I might be a little bit biased just because of my ETL background. But I remember when I was working for a number of those data integration tool vendors, this was before BigQuery was even a publicly available thing. So it's that kind of time frame where everything is on premises. The idea of an ELT pipeline with using push down optimization or something like that was something that always looked really good on a slide, but nobody ever dreamt of using it, because you're hammering down on your Exadata box or your Vertigo box or whatever. And then every time you do that, some data center ops person is going to come yell at you, or some DBA is going to come yell at you and be like, what are you doing to my instance? What's really interesting to me is this move, especially with BigQuery. I think that's primarily and uniquely positioned to take advantage of this. But ELT can become a reality now, right? Because once the compute constraints went away, and with the introduction of things like flat rate pricing and reservations, you're not worried about runaway queries and stuff like that. So cost controls are in there. So there's a lot of things that are built around it that allow for an ELT pipeline to be successful. So I'm noticing a shift in what customers do, where they start to move into just streaming data into BigQuery, and then using things like scheduled queries to push things down and transform and create new data sets within BigQuery. when BigQuery scripting came out, that's been interesting because that now allows for programmatic transformation of data. And the open source world is also pretty interesting too. So right now, I know this is the chatter in a lot of people right now, but DBT is probably my favorite open source project right now. And I've looked at it probably at an intermediate level. Like I know it enough to be dangerous now and ruin some data person's day. But that to me is really fascinating because now they're putting in a sort of DevOps CI/CD methodology, SQL queries, which to me was really fascinating. And the ability to leverage BigQuery's horsepower and use a source controlled methodology for data models, like that to me is really, really cool. And I'm really bullish on that. But yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting too. I feel the same way. Big fan of DBT. They actually have a coalesce going on this week too, which is kind of cool.
Yes.
So,
yep. I've been watching some of those sessions, and those. Yeah, I'll circle back on that. I don't want to interrupt you.
No worries. But yeah, it definitely feels like it's sort of this interesting golden age of, I don't know what it would be like, DataStax 2.0 or something like that, 3.0 maybe. Maybe 3, because you had the 90s and the kind of whatever you had in the 2000s to now. But it definitely felt like around, what was it, 2015? Well, I think it was Redshift, I think that was the one that really blew up the whole scene. And because it was like the first time you had like cheap data warehousing available to the public, for like, 24 cents an hour or something like that.
Yeah.
That's cool. I remember getting on that pretty early on, but then I started noticing around, 2015, like the ELT paradigm started picking up. And I remember actually getting a email one time from one of the founders of Fivetran. He's like, do you want to move some data from Postgres into Redshift? And I'm like, it only costs you like, a few bucks a month. And I'm like, that seems really stupid. And no, I'm not interested. And of course, I'm like the dumb one because I should have taken advantage of it. But, at the same time, I was like, it's, I realized the thesis was correct immediately after I said no. She's like, oh, I'm dumb. But you could do transformations in the data warehouse. That was a cardinal sin back in the day. And I think that's even when people were using cloud early on, I felt like it was still viewed as an anti-pattern. Like if you weren't doing ETL, like you weren't a real person. Like, what are you trying to do here? Like we do ETL here, not the other way around. What are you talking about? This is crazy. But fast forward today, and that's the norm. Like I don't know that many people starting out new data workflows doing ETL.
Yeah.
Have you seen that recently? I haven't. So
I still do, especially in larger enterprises. I still see that pattern. I don't think by any means it's going to go away anytime soon, but I think there will be an eventual migration towards ELT.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. And then the next thing I'm interested in too was just what comes next. I mean, with the advent of streaming, you mentioned streaming into BigQuery, for example, and that's sort of the thing I'm interested in. It's kind of what's next for data transformations, because you sort of have like DBT. I think it does a really good job at kind of more batch focused workloads, but as the world moves more towards streaming, I've been thinking about this all weekend or last weekend, but I obviously have a very exciting weekend too.
Sounds exciting to me. But
yeah, I know. I was actually writing about this for my book, and it's just like, okay, so I was writing about transformations. Like, okay, so what's after ELT, right? Like what? Because there really hasn't been, if you look back, there hasn't been a big, especially in dimensional modeling, there hasn't been a big paradigm shift in probably 20 plus years now. What was the last one I saw? The major one was maybe Data Vault, and that was from like 2000, I think. And maybe there's been a few others along the way, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on data modeling or anything like that related to ELT, but.
What? So you asking more specifically about data modeling, or are you thinking about streaming, or
streaming with data modeling? Yeah, or data modeling with streaming. So
I don't really know, and the reason I don't know is because to be frank, I haven't seen that much with customers, even whether it was here at SADA or whether it was with the customers that I worked at Google. And the reason my hypothesis around why I haven't seen it that much is I think, like, even though the infrastructure with messaging services and streaming technologies and all that stuff, even though the infrastructure and the technology is ready and enabled for it, I'm not sure that the people have caught up to it.
That makes a lot of sense.
So things such as simple as, data governance and data quality controls, right? So if you have a whole bunch of different sources that are streaming data at you at a high velocity, how do you ensure that the data is coming in is clean, reconciled, not duplicated, and it's manageable? So that way, if I have a real-time analytics dashboard and that's streaming in from X number of different sources, the faster the data comes in, if you don't control it, the faster the problems come up, right? And the faster you're going to make a bad decision off of data you haven't verified. So, when I look at whether it's BigQuery's streaming capabilities, or if I look at what Databricks and Snowflake are talking about in their marketing materials, I'm like, yeah, you can get the data in there really quickly, and that's great. But it's like, have you put the human controls in? Have you put the governance controls on that? And I think a lot of customers are still trying to figure out, what do I even do with my batch data to a certain extent?
Yeah.
They just haven't conceptually gotten there yet. And that's really why I don't have an answer to that, because I haven't really had to think about it.
No worries. No, and it's something I don't have an answer to either, frankly,
Yeah.
because I think for a lot of the same reasons, it's, the streaming workloads, a lot of them I do see, I'm kind of wondering, does it need to be real time?
Yeah.
So, because the question I always have is what action are you going to take if you get the data, that much quicker, right?
Yeah.
So, but yes, it's something I've been thinking quite a bit about, and just wondered if you had an answer to it, because I certainly don't right at this point. So
Yeah, and the customer's got to think about the cost benefit of that too, because that's a new skill set you have to hire. You have to put more infrastructure in. You have to take more time, people, process to manage all that. So, like, is that worth the extra investment on your part? So if your end goal is to calculate, quarterly sales, maybe that's not that important. But if you're like a threat assessment company, maybe that real time is worth it. So it really depends on what you're looking for. But
yeah, it seems to be, it's an interesting space. I know I'm keeping my eyes open to see what happens there over the next several years, because at the same time, it's interesting too, because you're starting to see these kind of next generation, OLAP databases coming out, whether it's like a Rockset or Firebolt's, putting a lot of people on notice now. So yeah, it should be interesting to see. I mean, where do you see the data space going over the next 3 to 5 years?
Ooh.
Asking a lot of easy questions today, obviously. So
next 3 to 5 years. I think the big thing will be the continued democratization of data to the community. I think a lot of the organizational barriers that I've seen with regards to access to data within a company, the ability to freeform analyze data will be more democratized, and I think the tooling is going to continue to get easier so more people can understand it. I'm thinking back to some of the customers I've seen through production, and a lot of the, in the quote unquote old world where you had a physical server, and people, in order to get access to even pre-production data, you had to fill out X number of forms, get approvals for this, that, and that. And when I would ask them, why do they do that? One of the reasons would be around compute constraints, which, the more people you have hammering your database box, the slower it's going to be. But cloud technologies have gotten rid of that constraint, so that's gone. Things like security and governance controls are often a typical other reason as well. But if you look at like Google Cloud's DLP solution, if you look at some of the other cloud vendors and some of the redaction and detection capabilities of PII, like that governance control is only going to get better. So I think you'll see customers and organizations start to trust that more, and then give more access to more people, which ultimately, more hands make for less work. So you're going to see better insights come out the more people look at it, I think. And to transform data, I'm going to go back to the DBT again, but tools like that really do give an easier environment for analysts to become a data engineer and start to create their own data sets and their secondary, tertiary data sets. So I think you're going to see more more of that happening. I think the merging of AI ML into the data warehouse is only going to continue. And that I have, like, that could go in one of a million different ways, and I don't know where it's going to go.
Are you talking about the ability to do AI and ML directly from the data warehouse?
Yeah, like where the data lives in the data pipelines at scale and very, very quickly. I think that's going to be pretty fascinating, because the more, in conjunction with everything we've talked about now, that leads to you having better, cleaner, and more actionable data at large volumes, which means you have more training data you can rely on, which gets you more interesting predictions. So being able to incorporate that into the pipeline or into the warehouse, like, I'm curious to see where that's going to go, but that's really a big wild card, which I don't think anyone can accurately predict.
In the same way too, like I see, like a lot of companies are using Databricks because it's, probably perceived as being a better data science platform. Therefore, because it kind of started out as Spark and now it's Lakehouse or whatever. So
there'll be a new term next month. Don't worry.
Yeah, there will be. So it was kind of funny, actually. I was in reInvent last week, and the moment I get out of the gate, it's Databricks has their posters, and it was like Lakehouse and Data Warehouse, and it was just the whole ride into downtown was pretty much just like trash talking between these, the two big vendors in that space there. I thought that was just hilarious, but yeah, it's interesting though, because the confluence of, like, where does AI live these days? I think about that a lot too. Is it including a data warehouse? For AI workloads, it's definitely one place. Obviously, for unstructured data, it could go elsewhere. But what are your thoughts?
So you bring up something interesting that I saw someone else post something on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago, and they talked about this very recent, very public, visible spat that seems to be going on with different vendors around benchmarks. And
that one.
Yeah, it's like, hey, my database is a little bit faster than yours, and the post was talking about those benchmarks and saying the general gist of it was, it doesn't, the performance, it's not as big a thing as we all make it out to be, and really it's about the usability of it. And I think that's what's really going to win, because it almost feels like, Dr. Evil, $100 billion, right? Like, at a certain point, these numbers are meaningless. And whether you're serving 2 billion, 3 billion hamburgers, like, does anyone really care? And if you want to talk about the future of data, I think a lot of that kind of stuff, if it hasn't already, it's quickly going to become commoditized, and the playing field is going to be fairly even. And to the point where it's like, that kind of thing is going to be assumed. And if your data platform can't handle that, then you're not even going to be considered. Right. Like, that should be playing stakes. It should not be a differentiator. It should be table stakes. And I think the platform that has the best tooling around it, the best community around it, the easiest, the lowest barrier to entry, and the strongest partner ecosystem, I think that's going to be the one that wins.
Totally agree. And cost controls too.
Yeah,
that's a big one too. But yeah, I completely agree. It's especially now that I think both these vendors have kind of opened up the kimono, so to speak, with benchmarking. I think it'll make it a little bit easier now, because I just thought it was silly. Like, why do you have restrictions on benchmarking in the first place? Like, I don't know, maybe call me old fashioned or something, but I figure, like, testing's out, but it'd be good to get at least, like, verified opinions from people who actually do benchmarking for a living, and just understand, okay, like, what do you recommend? And so I just figure the market is it's a good weighing machine, as the old saying goes. And so.
Yeah, and I saw some of the limitations on that, because there was a recent blog post that I wrote about testing out BigQuery's geospatial capabilities and trying to do it at scale. And that was one of those things where I wanted to compare that against some of the other cloud data warehouses. And of course, our legal team and Google's legal team looked at the terms of service on some of them. They're just like, nope, there's no benchmark. I'm like, okay, well, that's not helpful. So, I mean, if you're really that confident about it, you should open it up to that. But it's also, we created our own testing methodology. We documented it, threw it up on GitHub. Anyone can use it. Here's a SQL script. Like, have at it. And if we're wrong, tell us. Let's talk about it, because that's an interesting conversation. But I think, if you really want to start talking about benchmarks, let us benchmark it.
Yeah, exactly. So and I'm curious to see how it all goes, especially again because there's a traditional data warehouse workloads that everyone that benchmarks, right? It was a TCPH.
Yep.
Yeah. But then what I'm curious about, kind of bringing it back to AI, is now, okay, so AI workloads against a data warehouse. That's something that I don't know anyone's been benchmarking, but that's, to me, those are the new workloads in the data warehouse world, is blending that in with traditional BI. Traditional BI, I mean, shit, that's been around for longer than we have. So, but the machine learning use cases, I think you bring up a tremendous point there, where it's just integrating, kind of this data store with AI ML, maybe bake it in as a first class citizen. Maybe you don't, I don't know. That again, as you bring up though, that's a UI issue, that's a user experience issue. And so. Yeah.
And there's, I'll never forget this. This was a long time ago, back when I was at Informatica. So this was maybe about like 2009, 2010 or so. I was we were pitching to an insurance company, and I forget, were we competing against Oracle or IBM? But one of the issues that we found was that we came in with a series of multiple different vendors, because we had to partner with a bunch of different companies to do that. And I think it was Oracle. Oracle just came in with one Oracle team and said, we can solve this for you. And we told the CIO then, like, look, they're probably bringing in partners behind, they're subcontracting, they're going to bring in third-party solutions. It's going to be no different. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, I don't care to a certain extent, like, who has a superior technology. Whoever can make this all work with the least amount of pain is getting my money. And so it kind of gets me to what you're talking about now, where if your TPCH benchmark is a few seconds faster than someone else's, like, does anyone really care? But if I can tell you that I can do your analytics and give you a prediction in the same workflow, in the same interface, with the same code base, and it's super easy to use, it might be a couple seconds slower. Like, I'm willing to bet 9 times out of 10, that's the one that's going to win.
Right. Because it's about productivity, developers and engineers, right? So too many people ignore that. They're just like, well, it's fast. It's cool. For some things, that's great, right? Like, I think for embedded analytics use cases or data apps, like, fast speed's great. Should be fast. But
I could buy a kit car and assemble it myself, and it'd probably be really great. Or I could spend a little bit more money and buy a Ferrari.
You could do that, just a little bit more, but it's fine. So that's awesome, man. And kind of switching gears a bit, I see you a lot on social media, and we've hung out a couple times. And but what do you do outside of work? Like, what makes you tick?
Ooh. I do love whiskeys.
Awesome.
I'm a quite avid fan of whiskeys. Actually, one of the things I do as well that's probably not as obvious is I do birdwatch.
Really?
Yeah. That is something it's something I picked up during the pandemic, because so it was last year, peak pandemic. We're talking in the middle of the first wave, when no one knew what the heck was going on. Mm-hmm. We didn't know what it was. All we knew is that we had to be outside and far away from each other. and one of my very good friends here in New York, she said, hey, let's go bird watching. And I had never even considered doing that. But it ticked all the boxes, right? Like, you're outside, you're far apart from other people, you're not interacting with strangers. And it was really, I think, in a very high stress time, it was a very relaxing thing to do. And it just became a hobby that I picked up. And sustainability has also been something that's been top of mind for me for a while. And bird watching was it tied into it in a way, because like their migratory patterns are changing due to climate change and all that stuff. And so it's still relevant and interesting to me in that lens, but it's also just a fun thing to do. And yeah, that's been something I picked up in the last couple of years.
That's really cool. What are the good bird watching spots in New York?
Central Park, surprisingly, it turns out to be a very, very good bird watching spot. And after living here for 13 years, I had no idea that Central Park was. But apparently during the migration from north to south, like from Canada to South America, this is one of the main hopping spots for the East Coast birds in the migratory pattern. Yeah, so you get a lot of different birds throughout the year, and they all chill out in Central Park. And because there's a lot of wooded areas in the Ramble and in the North Hill and things like that. So it's very good for that. And up in the Bronx, there's parks. In Brooklyn, there's Prospect Park. Like pretty much any major green space in the city tends to be a pretty good bird watching spot, it turns out.
Be careful, those birds are going to gentrify those areas. So
possibly.
Joking. That's really, really cool. Yeah, I'm trying out bird watching something. It never occurred to me either. Like that actually sounds kind of appealing. So
yeah, just on a day if you have nothing to do, you just find a big park and then you find some binoculars or something and just head out and see what happens.
Interesting. That sounds really cool. Awesome, man. Well, cool. It's been a fun chat. For people who want to learn more about you, how would they do that?
Just our website, SADA.com, tends to have a lot of our information around service offerings, as well as what we do, our customer base and things like that. We have a blog called SADA Insights, which is where I publish to a lot for official company related. There's customer interviews, there's executive level interviews, there's thought pieces. And I do post on Medium a whole bunch. And so medium.com/Brian Suk is my username. So anything technical, I try to post on there as well. And yeah, I'm always talking at conferences and things like that. So I'll probably run into viewers at some point or another.
Yeah, for sure. Or bird watching, either way. So.
Or bird watching, yeah. If you want to do that too, let me know.
Awesome. Brian, it's been a lot of fun having you on the Data Nerd Herd. So yeah, hope we catch up in person sometime too. It'd be great. So.
Absolutely, yeah. It's good seeing you again. And yeah, it's been fun. I appreciate the time.
Anytime, man. All right, take care. See ya.